Hi there, I'm Richard Bell, and this is my presentation on the science of reading. So by the end of this presentation, you, the viewer, will be able to reproduce an informed summary of the science of reading, understand on a cursory level its origin, and see and understand its application and implications in the classroom. So the science of reading is a culmination of evidence-based research from various fields like neuroscience and educational psychology regarding the study of how humans understand rhythm language. And so we've been able to use like fMRIs, EKGs, EEGs, behavioral science to be able to actually pinpoint in time specific neurological reactions and things like that happen whenever we're experiencing reading comprehension. And that's allowed us to diagnose and pinpoint on a biological level what is actually happening whenever we have reading deficits and things like that. And then we as educators in the state of Arkansas begin drawing upon this research to make informed literacy instruction, especially to better serve struggling readers in our schools. It's statewide professional development that's required from all teachers regardless of content area. And it's provided neurological context for us to reevaluate how we're educating readers and has opened doors for more targeted and effective instruction. The first of the 4 theoretical models that are under the science of reading, or that we use to interpret the research that's within the science of reading, is Scarborough's Rote. And it is the most comprehensive and possibly the most complex of all of the illustrations, certainly, that you'll see. And it encompasses wholly the entire method of reading. And it was invented by Hollis Scarborough after about 20 years of brain research, came up with this analogous model of the complexity of how to read, and as you can see, it's pretty complex. There's 2 main braids, language comprehension and word recognition. And word recognition is kind of the one that we associate with phonics or phonological awareness, which phonological awareness is an attempt to is a manipulation of various aspects of oral language, like words, syllables, rhymes, and phonemes fall under this umbrella too, and that is the ability to manipulate individual sounds and words. You have decoding, which is reading, and there's encoding, which is spelling, and then sight reading, that's a musical term, sight recognition, which is essentially automatic word recognition. And on top of that is the language comprehension, which is kind of all of the minutia and experience, the background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge, so like genres, thematics, things like that. And these are increased as we increase the automatic nature of the word recognition strand. So these become tighter and tighter and tighter until they start to coil around each other. And that's when we see, as you can see, the definition of skilled reading, which is fluent execution and coordination of word recognition and text comprehension. To simplify that, which is super necessary for diagnostic purposes, we have the simple view of reading. And this was invented by Gao and Turner, P.B. Gao, in 1986. And it's really in a rebuke of the whole language model. And so this really is probably the answer in the debate between code emphasis and meaning emphasis, which is that you learn language as a code, and you use that code to decipher the printed text that's in front of you to derive meaning, as opposed to the meaning emphasis, which is using the whole word as it is and deriving meaning of that word via context clues or via sight recognition. The simple view of reading establishes that both decoding and language comprehension have 2 separate values. And if one is in deficit to the other, then we're able to diagnose very specific learning and reading disabilities. So for example, disproportionately higher score in comprehension than in decoding is a sign of dyslexia. And so we know about the symptomology of dyslexia that it's obviously a decoding problem, and then we know that we need to work on decoding to reinforce that student's reading behaviors. And the vice versa of which is hyperlexia, where a student is able to decode everything they see and make an understanding of that, but there's a disconnect between their decoding abilities and their breadth of knowledge to actually decode what they're reading. And in the middle, in a general low score or a sort of parallel deficit in either of the in both things as a whole is garden variety general reading disability. And this allows us to identify, establish, and design an individual instructional plan for the student. It's really nice because it actually, as not a reading specialist, it's important for me, and I think a lot of us who aren't in content areas that directly engage literacy as a teachable moment, even though that we all are now, is that reading is about 5,000 years old and isn't something that is biologically inherent, as opposed to oral communication, which is something that we've actually evolved to develop through just static stimulus. The next one is the 4-pot processors, and this is kind of the one that's most useful for me, I feel like, because it allows me to pay attention to the relationships between all of the different things that are required to produce good reading. And it makes me feel that I'm not above my head in this kind of. And so you have the phonological processor and the orthographic processor. And so phonological processing is actually the processing of oral language, and an orthographic processor is the process of visual code. And whenever we're asking a student to actually read, we're actually asking them to use the phonological processor to decode visual code. And so the orthographical processor and the phonological processor come together and are responsible for phonics. It kind of ignores the top of Scarborough's rope a little bit, which I feel like is okay in this situation. So the context processor is concepts, information, sentence constructs, text structure, all that stuff that's required on the top of Scarborough's rope. And then they come together and they have what's the meaning processor, which is vocabulary and allows for skilled reading to occur. These all work in tandem with each other, and it is the instructor's responsibility to reinforce and help build these neuronal pathways that are these relationships. And then we have Every's phases. I hope I'm saying that right. And so this takes us through word recognition and reading development from 4 different phases. 4 seems to be a lucky number in all of this. There's a lot to do with the bottom braid Scarborough's rope, like I said. They're not hard stages, but kind of like more like phases, and it goes from pre-alphabetic to consolidated alphabetic. The pre-alphabetic is incidental visual cues, which are associating. Last night, my son and I went to a pizza place, and there's a pizza, like a big giant metal pizza on top of the pizza building, and my son looks at that and recognizes it as pizza and knows that inside the building there is pizza. All the way up to consolidated reading, or consolidated alphabetic, which is essentially being able to look at like the word information, pull a morpheme out, the morpheme in form, and then be able to assess the affix that is attached to inform, and then be able to derive meaning from it. We're going to go through some paraphrase definitions that I use throughout there and what they mean to me. For me, phonological awareness is the understanding of the overall sound system in language. Whenever I think about phonological awareness, I try to, that was the basic, simplest I could get. Phonics is the teaching of the relationship between words and sounds, and that's where those 2 processors come in, is that we actually develop, that's why it falls into phonological awareness. And then there's vocabulary, which is the words used in a particular language. Fluency is the ability to express oneself easily, adequately, and articulately, and quickly, and to be able to dissociate a certain level of energy from your thought processes to associate more to meaning, as opposed to actually deriving the information that's in the visual code that you're processing. And that leads into code emphasis and meaning emphasis, which is the argument that kind of spurred all this along, has been going on for years and years. Is 2 thoughts about teaching reading is the idea that code emphasis relies heavily on a specific set of words or sounds to use to code. Books that specifically work on certain sounds and certain letter-sound relationships, and a specific lesson that was taught directly to improve that particular skill set or that particular realm. And then there's meaning emphasis, which relies heavily on the context and the whole word. And we're thinking chapter books, and we're thinking and things like that. Reading to increase fluency, which kind of, once you really look at the science of reading, sort of seems like you're beating your head against the wall a little bit. And it isn't sold as effectively in the science of reading as code emphasis. And then there's orthographic mapping, which is actually what we're doing in direct instruction and what the simple view of reading, the literature really supported. And it's how we associate and comprehend codes of print by co-opting the parts of the brain that process spoken language. So we're not born with the material that is designated to learn to read. We actually kind of teach our brains to use the speech processors of the brain in a way that allows us to process visual code. It's really amazing. It's a miracle. In my conclusion, the aforementioned theoretical models, including the science of reading, allow teachers to have a diagnostic responsive tool set in evidence, which allows us to teach students to read regardless of deficiency. It gives us an insight into what deficiencies are, and kind of exonerates people with deficiencies as being something that is common and something that is not to their detriment. It also points out in a wonderful sort of way, as I just said, that reading is a newer convention in the scale of human existence, and that co-opting the speech centers of the brain is an extraordinary phenomenon, and no wonder that the struggles can happen during the neurological circuit of building skilled reading. And now that we have the technology to actually watch that sort of spontaneous evolution in hand, it allows us to help our students along the way. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And this has been my presentation.